Thank you for having me and then showing up as well. I really appreciate it. Like Mike said, I'm Megan Duncan. I am Megan A. Duncan. If you ever run into the Megan S. Duncan over in the geoscience departments, we get each other's emails all the time. And I am in my third year in the School of Communication. My research is really based on news. I really love news and democracy. And so I'm really interested in specifically how audiences are engaging with and understanding the credibility of online news and emerging news forums. My research in particular looks at some partisan differences. So I'm interested in overall understanding how can we build that news system that informs everybody of the basic facts so that we can start from a shared reality to have policy debates. Today, I took a couple of my works together that look specifically at how crowdsourcing and credibility would work together. My other research looks a lot at who participates in online commenting, how people perceive news that's about partisanship and things like that. But again, today I'm interested in talking about credibility that is crowdsourced. And Mike, am I allowed to share my screen? Or I guess Sarah, the reason that crowdsourced credibility stories would be important may seem a little bit obvious, especially this week after Twitter announced that they're going to start doing more crowdsourcing of misinformation. But my research question kind of goes back to 2018 when Facebook said they were going to do the same. They said that they would ask participants and users from their sites, how much do you trust each of these domains? And use that, what they called a trustworthy rating, to inform their algorithms about what kinds of news you see and what kinds of news you don't see. And I want to show you a short clip of Zuckerberg talking about this process. And while, again, we've probably all heard about this news, I want you to listen to the particular rhetoric that he uses to justify the crowdsourcing.
That there aren't enough fact checkers suggesting this alternative.
I think the real thing that we want to try to get to over time is more of a crowdsourced model, where it's not that people are trusting some basic set of experts who are accredited, but are in some kind of lofty institution somewhere else.
Yeah, that's former Harvard student deriding lofty institutions to a Harvard law professor. Joining me now, NBC.
So there's this kind of anti-intellectualism undercurrenting his justification. And that was also very apparent in the Facebook post that he used to share this news. He said we considered asking outside experts, but that wouldn't solve the objectivity problems. Instead, we asked our community because the community is the most objective. And we saw this rhetoric kind of repeated in the announcement for Birdwatch from Twitter, the idea that people didn't want credibility labels or credibility indicators to come directly from Twitter, that they wanted this community voice, and that was really important to them. So I was interested in knowing, do people really trust crowdsourced credibility information above experts, above authorities? And so I asked 1,000 US residents earlier this year about if this is true. And the specific question I asked was, how much do you trust the following groups to be objective about choosing what news you see? And we see these answers fall into two big groups. The highest group were journalists, university researchers, and people at nonprofits. So they still trust us. They still trust journalists more than these other groups. Falling into the lower group were employees at social media companies algorithms developed by social media companies, and everyday people participating in crowdsourcing. Yeah, we know that they're part of the anti-intellectualism rhetoric and in the country is asymmetrical partisan wise. So zooming in and separating out participants of different ideologies, we do see differences among ideologies about their trust in who can be objective. So the three with asterisks after them are the ones that are significantly different by ideology. Liberals trust university researchers, journalists, and nonprofits a significantly larger amount than both moderates and conservatives. With the other three groups, the differences are not significantly different. That they are about the same. Interestingly, though, the absolute value, though not significantly different, for crowdsourcing is the only one where conservatives trust that group more than than liberals trust that group. So overall, liberals have a greater trust in all of these groups except for crowdsourcing. So we don't really have evidence from this that crowdsourcing is going to do a better job of cutting through partisan disbelief or tendency to believe. But we do see that perhaps there would be problems with journalists, researchers, and nonprofits as having a disproportionate belief by different partisan groups. So this leads me to questions, all kinds of big research questions about how does the audience actually think of as objective? Within journalism, we've been going through this wrestling of what is objectivity and changing a lot of what we've used to call objectivity, what we used to think of as the appearance of objectivity. But has the audience been doing the same thing? And who do they believe that can be objective? And when objective groups are the ones making these credibility labels, are they going to work better? So sure, we can show that the audiences believe that a group making an objectivity or credibility label were objective, but does that actually have the intended secondary effect? So today I'm going to be talking really super briefly about some of the theoretical foundations that I work with. And then we're going to zoom in on 3 experiments that I have done. The first group is, to what extent do crowdsourced credibility labels actually work in the intended way? And the second is looking more at the credibility crowdsourcing systems and who participates in them. And then I'll end with a couple of discussion thoughts and practical ideas. So again, quickly thinking about some of the theoretical concepts that my work is based on, I'm interested in sort of the perceptions of public opinion and their effects. So we start with hostile media perception, which is the idea that the more that you believe news media influences the opinions of others, the more that you believe it's biased against you. So this works from both angles. Two people who have opposing ideologies can read the exact same news story, and they both rate it as biased against them. And then an extension of that is the corrective action hypothesis. This still is based on the idea that a lot of audience members believe the news media influences others a lot more than they believe it influences them. And so in order to correct public opinion, including to make sure that their side gets their story out there, even if they're in the minority of public opinion, they're willing to speak up and share their opinion to correct that perception. And so some of the developing theories and findings off of these 2 theories is that we find people share news in a partisan manner. So people are sending fact checks or clicking that share button in ways that agree with their ideologies and their pro-attitudinal views. And also we've seen a couple of studies emerge about how people would participate in crowdsourcing. And I'll talk more about that specific study a little later today. But the idea is that this study found that when we scale up, when we have so many people participating in a crowdsourcing system, that those partisan sharing behaviors we saw in the other studies wash out, that only well-recognized mainstream brands rise to the top. So first I asked, what is the influence? How well do crowdsourced credibility ratings actually work to change the perception of public opinion, of the credibility of a news story? And so in this first experiment, I put a bunch of different kinds of credibility labels on the same news story. So all participants were reading the same news story, and they saw the same credibility labels. The difference was where those credibility labels came from. In one condition, there was no explanation at all about what these credibility labels meant. They were there, but you might not be able to interpret them. In another condition, it was the website itself, the news website, telling you where the credibility labels meant and how to interpret them. And then I played with the timing a little bit. So in one case, the timing was simultaneous to the news story. And in one case, it popped up before you even read the news story. So you were confronted with that information before you got a chance to make an impression of credibility for that news story. And then in the fourth condition, the credibility indicators were crowdsourced. Again, this was a controlled experiment, so it wasn't really crowdsourced. I just told participants that. And I was measuring two dependent variables. First, I was measuring whether people paid attention and understood and could interpret the meaning of those credibility labels. So did they even remember what they meant and try to apply that to their updated perception of credibility? And second, I measured the actual perception of credibility. So here's the stimulus material. It looked much better in the actual app than it did here, but you can see that there are a bunch of symbols up here that you wouldn't necessarily know what they meant. There were some points, a grade, some source information, and a verification number. All things made up, kind of in the vein of we didn't know how to interpret the blue check mark on Twitter until we saw it, right? So we didn't know that credibility indicator indicated credibility until we learned about it. So how do we understand these things before they even exist? And so the first dependent variable was, did people actually learn what those indicators meant? Were they able to recall and interpret that they, in this particular case, meant that the story was credible? So this experiment used positive credibility indicators. And the best teacher of what they meant, how to interpret, in this particular case was the authority, the website, but the timing was before they saw the story. So providing that information before they even had a chance to make an impression of the credibility of that story worked overall best. But we saw a partisan disparate effect among those who got the crowdsourced tips, where it worked better for those among who identify as liberal than it worked for those who identify as conservative. So in this particular case, well, overall, the average worked best for the pop-up from the website. We did see the crowdsourced tips, the crowdsourced credibility indicators work best for liberals compared to conservatives. And all of these were compared to a control condition. The overall average for both the crowdsourced tip and the pop-up from the website were better than the control condition. The simultaneous one was not better than control. So the second step is, does it really matter? Like, does this have an influence on the way participants perceive the credibility of the news story? And overall, the answer is that while they were able to interpret and remember these crowdsourced labels, it didn't do too much to change their perception of credibility compared to the control condition. Again, the pop-up worked best of for changing the perceived credibility compared to the control. But you can see these are fractional decimal numbers. It's not making a huge difference to folks. And interestingly, while we found that liberals remembered and were able to interpret those crowdsourced indicators best compared to conservatives, it didn't particularly change their perception of credibility to any significant extent. The next experiment, it looks at, well, how would these crowdsourced credibility systems even work? Who would participate, and what effect would it have on the crowdsourced ratings? So in this experiment, I looked at that Pennycook and Rand study in 2019 that used 60 news brands, 60 domains, and asked participants how much they trusted each of them. And these 60 news brands I wanted to replicate, but many of them had either gone defunct or been removed for the internet. Some of them that he had used, probably unwittingly, were like those Russian sites that were taken down, some of those Macedonian sites. So not all of them existed. So I kind of had to fiddle to replicate it a little bit. But two of the things that I changed from that Pennycook and Rand study include the idea that I thought 60 news brands was a real lot of cognitive load for the average participant. So I shrank that down to 20. And I switched up the composition of those news brand menus that I was presenting to participants for them to rate. Whereas Pennycook and Rand gave them all the same exact menu, I moved the composition so it include a liberal partisan news brand menu and a conservative partisan news brand menu. I also included a menu that was just our average mainstream brands that we think of most, and a menu that mixed all three of the other ones up. The second manipulation I added was, while Pennycook and Rand forced every participant to rate all 60 news brands, I allowed half of the participants to choose how many they rated. So this would replicate more of a voluntary system than a forced mandatory system. So if people get to opt into a crowdsourced credibility system, how will they behave, and how would that be different than if they were forced to rate all these same brands? And I, in this study, measured two dependent variables. The first was among those who were assigned to the choice condition, among those who could rate brands or not, how many did they actually rate? And the second was, obviously, what were the credibility ratings that folks gave these menus? So looking at just some descriptive results, these are pretty much, I think, again, what we would expect, and what support Pennycook and Rand's findings that the brands that are most well known, the brands we're most used to and most familiar with, are the ones that raise to the top. While some of those very ideological, very fringe websites get the lowest ratings. So first off, I was interested in looking whether giving the participants a choice makes a difference. And I found evidence that suggests that giving them a choice, A, makes a difference, and B, makes partisans a little bit more extreme in their ratings. So the two menus that the bars here are the participants' ideologies, and the horizontal axis that is the menu's ideology. On the left here, this is the dependent variable for the trustworthy rating, which was on a scale of 1 to 5. Nobody got that 5, so it's shrunk down a little bit. So folks who saw the liberal forced and the liberal choice saw the exact same 20 menu brands. So these two are the exact same thing. The only difference is folks over here got a choice of how many to rate. And same thing here. The conservative forced and the conservative choice are the exact same menu. The difference was, do you have a choice? And you'll see in both the conservative choice, conservatives rated the brands much more high than the conservatives rated the brands when they were forced to rate it. And when liberals had a choice about rating, they rated their own news brand higher than when they were forced to rate those same 20 news brands. So we see a little bit of activism when you give people that choice, that corrective action, the idea that you're going to go out there and make a choice to rate these brands. And that has an effect on the rankings. So again, thinking about if people are going to use these rankings to inform their algorithms, would it make a difference? And the answer is yes. A lot of news brands moved very far up or down the list when they were on a choice menu versus a forced menu. And these are the brands that moved the most. You'll notice they are all those kind of ideological news brands, from Breitbart moved up the most to brands like the Raw Story moved down the most. And second, my dependent variable was how many news brands are people actually rating. So this is a number that goes from 0 to 20 because you had that option. One interesting finding I had was even when they were given a choice, the average number of news brands that people rated out of a possible 20 sat right below 18. So it was like 17.8. People, even when I told them you can rate all the brands or none of the brands, it is up to you, still rated a majority of the brands in many cases. Yet we see significant differences about how many people rate the number of news brands and ideological differences. So when conservatives were shown a liberal news brand menu, they were rating more than when liberals were shown that same news brand menu. Same news brands on the menu. When it matched your ideology, you felt less motivated to rate brands than when it was from the opposing ideology. On the other side, same thing, a mirrored effect. When liberals saw a conservative news brand, they were rating almost all of them. And when conservatives saw that same news brand, they were rating fewer than when they saw the liberal news brand, and fewer than liberals who rated that same news menu. And so one of the benefits that I took advantage of from this composing these news brand menus would how is the same news brand rated differently when it appears on different menus. So again, these bars represent the participant ideology, where the horizontal axis represents the news ideology of the news menu. When CNN, so this graph shows specifically CNN and only CNN, which was included on 6 menus, both the forced and choice of the mainstream, the forced and choice of the liberal, and the forced and choice of the mixed, which was all of those things mixed up together. In the forced mainstream category, people of all ideologies rated CNN exactly the same. But in almost every other category, we see a ideological difference about how people rated CNN in this crowdsourced credibility system. So when CNN was included on that same menu, the same mainstream menu, but people were given a choice of whether to rate or not, then we see conservatives rate CNN much lower than they did when they were forced to rate it. And liberals rated it lower too, but not quite the same extent. We see that same attenuation for the liberal menu. Liberals are rating CNN higher than conservatives when it is included on a liberal menu. And then when we get to the mixed menu, we see the same thing. So what menu, the other brands on a news credibility menu to rate for a crowdsourcing system is going to make a big difference about how a specific brand is rated relative to other brands and relative to whether it was the mixture of other brands was changed up. So we know that this is going to make a difference and going to be a necessary thing to think about in designing these crowdsourcing systems. So to wrap up with a couple of thoughts, first thought is what is driving these social media companies to lean so much onto crowdsourced credibility labeling systems? From what evidence I can find, there's still evidence that people are still trusting their institutions more than the crowd. We don't have a lot of behavioral evidence that would suggest that crowdsourcing is overall more believed than experts. So it's money saving. It's a little bit of abdicating, offloading that potential for controversy. And I read a New Yorker story this morning that talked about Mark Zuckerberg saying that he was offloading a lot of the decisions about banning people to the oversight board because it was just taking up too much of his time personally. So there's that to consider. Second of all, while there is a partisan response to crowdsourced credibility labels, we didn't see that effect following through onto their perception of credibility. So even though people might say that they want crowdsourced labels, it doesn't appear that that is influencing their perception of news credibility any more than experts or any sort of authority. And finally, though it's not integral to the specific idea of crowdsourcing, I think that we need to do more work talking about timing of credibility information and when that cue would be given in the news rating process. One thing to keep in mind is that this extension of the corrective action hypothesis suggests that more people are motivated to punish their political rivals than reward their political allies in a crowdsourcing system. And so we need to think about what are we going to motivate people to do to fairly, equally rate news organizations. Second of all, audience continue to rate familiar organizations better and more often than unfamiliar organizations. So using this system to decide who the winners and losers are is going to do harm to entrepreneurialism, journalism, and innovation in journalism. If you're going to start up a brand new news brand and try to get your stuff on Facebook, but Facebook is crowdsourcing whether they show other people your news or not, this system is going to harm you in favor of already established brands. And finally, the crowdsourcing events here, or the results here, have been done in these closed environments. But what happens when we get those bandwagon effects? People Redditors, hashtag Twitter, or Facebook groups deciding to target crowdsourcing credibility and punish brands that they don't like. So we know that, again, that people are really motivated to punish their political rivals. So when we are in a voluntary system and people say, hey, there's this opportunity to participate in crowdsourced credibility, go do it. They can send lots of followers to game the system. And so a couple of questions or thoughts for social media platforms to think about: how much intellectualism is really a problem, how much it is, and how much better crowdsourced labels will work than expertly researched labels. I encourage the platforms to think carefully about every bit of design of a crowdsourced labeling system. Tiny little decisions here are having big outsized effects. And while credibility labels tend to nudge participants in the right direction, it's not necessarily a magic wand to make them have the same perception of credibility as the credibility label. And finally, researchers need to do more to adopt expression theories, things that we've learned about public opinion and personal expression of opinion, to crowdsourcing. And that measuring attention to credibility labels isn't going to be enough to show that they're effective. We're also going to have to take that step to find out what we can do to actually change their perception of credibility. And finally, all of my work is these controlled experiments. So if somebody wants to deploy these out in the real world on real news websites, I'd love to see that kind of work. So thanks again. I appreciate your attention.